Chapter 1. The Heir Who Desired Truth. Lysanthra's skyline was a chandelier of continents, a labyrinth of prismatic avenues wound through spires hewn from living crystal. And every dawn the city rang like a throatful of bells as the sunlight spilled through 100,000 refractive facets to scatter rainbows on the faces of an empire that had forgotten where bread came from. Serindra of the Trisavian Consortium watched those rainbows every morning from a balcony that hovered without visible means over an imperial orchard of glittering fruit, and thought treacherously, privately, that color without meaning is only glare, that praise without understanding is only noise, that all the flattering courtiers and pliant tutors and carefully curated charity galas were no more than reflections of the same empty light bouncing around a palace whose foundations she had never laid and whose servants she had never truly seen. And so it was that on the day she reached her 21st orbit, the day tradition demanded she present her vision of stewardship to the Triarch, Serindra asked a question none of her lineage had voiced in living memory. How do I know anything we do helps the people we say we serve? The people whose unglamorous hands feed the reactors and harvest the light vines, and scrub the oxidizers, and bind the hulls, and steady the lifts when the winds punch the towers like fists. How do I know that kindness exists anywhere below these jeweled balconies, if every kindness shown to me arrives wrapped in the contortions of advantage? The Chamber of Counselors made the subtle frowns of the well-mannered offended and offered her the old parables, a philanthropic convoy to the rim, a foundation bearing her name, a survey conducted by drones and pattern miners. But Serindra, who had always obeyed perfectly in public, heard the word survey and felt in her bones an old sickness, the one where the truth is turned into data and the data is turned into a slogan, and the slogan becomes the door to another gala where the wine is poured over ignorance like scented oil. And she understood that she would have to use a different language to speak to reality. She would have to go down and be small. She would have to be no one. She would have to ask with her hands empty. She would have to risk hearing answers that could not be smoothed by a press release. The plan, when it finally came to her between midnight and the pearly first shudder of dawn, was indecent in the way steps toward honesty often are to a culture rehearsed in poise. She summoned Rel, the dresser who knew every seam of her body and every seamstress in the spires, and asked not as a princess, but with the directness of a person trying not to lie, to be made ugly, or at least unremarkable, to be stained and dimmed and layered in the wrong smells, to be draped in fiber that remembered factory floors and not gala corridors. Rel, who had been with Serindra since childhood and had watched her squint at the invisible, did not ask why and did not betray her, only fetched from the ward's forgotten trunks a long-ago costume for a civic opera in which the founders had crawled from the mines to the throne, and with a quiet precision took to it with solvent and grit and thread until it looked less like the well-meaning caricature of poverty and more like the truth of the wind in the underbridge, frayed where fingers always tug, stained where leaking pipes weep, burned in the pattern of a repair done with the wrong torch because that was the only torch at hand. Then Rel cut Serindra's hair, without ceremony, until it fell in unflattering planes, and smeared the crystalline tide of her skin with ash-gray balm that canceled the palace's flattering lights. And when the mirror returned a stranger, a ghost of a girl who had slept under bridges, Serindra felt her heart knock in her chest the way it had when she first steered a skyboat alone and the wind had tried to throw her, and she let that fear be a kind of compass that pointed not to safety but to meaning. At the base of the palace, where the public transit arteries braided like steel ivy, Serindra stepped from a service lift that smelled of ozone and disinfectant into air that smelled of cooked oil and rain in the concrete. And immediately the world changed scales. The towers became cliffs whose tops might as well be myth, the sky a tight ribbon cut by rails and courier ducts, and the faces, oh, the faces were not curated, not smiling to curry favor, not lifted to her eyes at all. They were turned toward screens and toward children and toward carts whose wheels squeaked, toward the math of the day's errands and the unglamorous heroism of carrying things. She walked until she no longer knew which of the numbered districts she had crossed, until the pavements lost their polish and the air gained an iron taste, until a bridge shouldered across a dry canal whose concrete ribs showed like a gutted beast's. And there she stopped where a slipstream of people split around a pillar whose base trapped eddies of dust and discarded wrappers. And because she had promised herself she would not survey from a distance but ask, she sank down with her back against the pillar and let her hands open on her knees like empty bowls. The first hour was only the study of flow. How boots and soft shoes and paw pads and cater tracks parted without looking. How the step changed when the workday turned and the carts grew heavier. How the shadows moved across the pillar like a clock. The second hour was hunger, and the third was the humility of learning to keep her gaze low, because direct eye contact at floor level was a currency and a challenge she did not yet understand. The fourth hour taught her the price of asking without words. A woman with machine oil under her nails dropped a roll of steamed starch and meat beside her knee without slowing. A child in a school cloak left a wrapped sweet with the care of placing an offering. A synthetic whose servo whisper ran in a rhythm like sighs placed a sealed packet of water and tapped twice on the pillar in a code Sarindra could not read, but felt like blessing. And in those small touches the daughter of wealth found the first honest gifts of her life and understood with shame that gratitude hurts when it is late. The incident that would change the vector of all her orbits began as a small kindness refused, or not refused but returned, and then insisted upon. A human and off-worlder by the gate, and by the plain canvas trousers bleached by too many suns came out of the cross-current with a toolbox on his shoulder and a coil of insulated wire at his hip and a face that had been spent on weather. Paused midstream with the kind of pause that breaks a person's day's equations and costs them money. Set the toolbox down between foot traffic like he had decided to matter here for a moment, and crouched without asking permission until his eyes were near level with hers. He did not ask if she needed saving. He did not lecture. He did not pity her with performance. He only said in a voice that sounded like the edge of a rock, "You look like you haven't had hot in a bit," and offered her a lidded cup that breathed the simple miracle of broth. Sarindra, whose laboratories had grown her cuisines in floating gardens and whose chefs crafted dishes that resembled galaxies, felt something unceremonious and wholly rise in her throat at the smell of salt and fat and onion. And she said the truest sentence she had ever said to a stranger, "Thank you," which in that place meant not the upward-facing ritual of court, but a narrow-band honesty like two wires twisted together until they conduct. He nodded as if the thank you had closed a circuit, set the cup in her hands, and without stepping away opened his toolbox and pulled out a short length of foam sheet stamped with an electrician's union emblem, slid it under her to lift her from the cold concrete as if it were the most obvious thing in the city, then straightened and shouldered the toolbox again with the soft grunt of a man adding a small errand to the long list that would make him tired tonight, and before he vanished back into the river he added, almost as an afterthought that made it safer to accept, "Gonna be rain in 20. The cross bay conduit leaks like an old kettle. Sit a little deeper under." It was the kind of kindness that assumes nothing, advertises nothing, asks nothing, costs a little, and it entered Sarindra like medicine, like a calibration the instruments of her life had been missing, and as the first drops struck the bridge with the damp, dusty smell of relief, she tucked herself deeper under the concrete lip and sipped broth that tasted, impossibly, like the tune her nurse used to hum when storms hit the high windows. Chapter 2. The Engineer of Small Repairs. The rain thickened to a steady run, drumming a rhythm on the conduit above that Sarindra felt in her shoulder blades through the pillar, and in that new acoustic the bridge became a listening chamber in which the people nearest to surviving learned to measure time by transit patterns and to measure trust by whether a stranger left their bags within reach. Sarindra finished the broth slowly, to train herself on the patience of small, practical warmths. And when the cup was empty, she did what Rel had taught her, cleaned it with the last sip of water, collapsed it without noise, hid it where it would not advertise value to desperate eyes, learning in minutes a handful of subtle rituals that might have taken months if she had arrived with cameras and staff and, as the rain found its pinhole in the old crossbay conduit, exactly where the human had predicted, a line of drips sketched a map on the concrete floor, and she smiled despite herself at the ferocious competence of a person whose predictions were about the way a joint ages rather than the movement of stock prices. She did not intend to see him again. She had meant for the experiment to be a set of days, a sample of stories, statistics translated into touch and hunger, and then back to the palace where she would at least speak with a new grammar. But intention yields to gravity, and the gravity beneath the bridge was this. When the storms were spent and the traffic thinned, when the sky peeled back to show the bruised underside of evening, he came back moving a little stiff in the way of a day that had not gone according to plan, but had been kept from disaster by sheer refusal to quit. And he did not come with a sermon about lessons from poverty, nor with the posture of a rescuer. He came with a handful of printed couplers and a belt pouch full of screws and a roll of mastic. And he set down the toolbox near the leak and spoke to the conduit the way a doctor speaks to an old patient. "All right, Tin Wizard. You can groan, but you don't get to flood my neighbors." Surindra watched, at first from the safety of anonymity, and then with the boldness of someone slipping over a line and discovering no alarms had been wired to the threshold, as he placed a battered sensor lens on the metal and read pressure differentials with a practiced squint, as he cut the printed couplers down by eye to marry the crooked seam, as he warmed the mastic with his palms and pressed it into place with a tenderness that would have embarrassed most princes, and she realized, unprepared for the sadness in the realization that she had seen the galaxy's most famous architects sketch cathedrals on reactive films and had believed, as her tutors wanted her to believe, that those were the gestures by which civilization is built, when in truth civilization is held together by a million such unbeautiful acts of maintenance. Small repairs that never make the news and never make a name and never trend, but keep the rain out of strangers' hair. When he finished, and the leak diminished to a sulk, he looked at the foam she sat upon, and at the cup she had hidden as instructed, and at her posture closed, and yet listening, and instead of questions he offered weather. "Tomorrow's a heat wave. Get shade early. The pavement throws it back like a forge." His eyes were a steady brown that took their time returning to a face once they had surveyed the problem at hand, and in that second look she felt something like a test being passed, not of her, but of whether a person could receive advice without extracting ego from the giving. She learned his name by the way others used it. Kale, with the K softened by a dozen accents because humans came to Lysanthra from every wind-blown corner of the spiral, and because the city despite its pride needed what a human like Kale brought, a peculiar blend of bricoleur and stubborn mule and gentle-handed maker who did not wait for orders from a boardroom to decide that a thing was worth fixing. His work, she learned by listening to jokes traded in the aftermath of repairs, ran the width of the infrastructure's nervous system, from airflow controllers in the oxygen farms to self-balancers on the elderly residential lifts, and he kept, in his head and in the calluses of his fingers, a map of the city that would have shamed her most expensive drones. Surindra did not tell him her name or her orbit or the circumference of her vault. She told him nothing except what an honest beggar would tell: a nod for good mornings, a murmur for thank yous, a shrug that ached when the hunger bit too long, and from that silence arose a friendship built of shared edges. He began to place, by her pillar, scrap cloth that caught wind without advertising itself as a blanket. He began to teach, with the casual pedagogy of a busy craftsperson, tiny tricks like how to keep your weight off the same hip for hours, or how to brace your back against vibrating structures to leach heat. And she began, to her own surprise, to be useful in the small roundabout ways that the pride of the helpless discovers when it is less helpless. She caught a runaway courier cart with a precisely placed foot. She calmed a child while his parent argued with a surly pay station. She pointed an old man to a public tap that didn't spit rust. In the third dusk of her experiment, which had by then stopped feeling like an experiment and started feeling like a conditional permission to be a person, the underbridge got the kind of trouble that tests character more than ideas. A trio of drifters came through with their eyes on the choreography of easy predators, not starving enough to be desperate, hungry enough to be mean, and one of them seeing the emblem on Kale's union pouch and seeing also the soft target of a woman seated near a toolbox planned aloud the worst arithmetic in that place. Tools plus fear equals yield. Kale, who had the sense not to perform masculinity for a crowd, did not square up or puff up. He simply said, in the voice of a man who has endured more bureaucracy than violence and knows therefore the bureaucrat's tone that stops things. You touch the union bag and the oxygen farm goes short on a hot day and the children's ward goes red and every crew in 4 districts gets sent to make it right, and then nobody gets paid because all the day's hours go to emergency rates, and I write your names in the log as the reason, which was such a perverse, civic, infuriating truth that the would-be thieves who wanted a fight or a whimper and not a lecture on systems flinched as if the conduit had spat at them. And Surindra, who had been braced for the kind of demonstration of power that always sounded like broken glass, exhaled a breath she hadn't known she was holding and understood that kindness was not a soft thing but a hard practice, a structure you build under the weight of the day, a chain of decisions that spare strangers unnecessary pain not out of sainthood but out of a ferocious, practical allegiance to the world as it is and could be repaired. When the drifters slouched off and the bridge's pulse returned to normal, Cale picked up the toolbox with the same gentleness he used on the printed couplers, glanced once at Surindra, as if to check that the human circuit he'd closed with broth still held its charge, and said only, "Holler if anyone tries sermonizing you into handing over your cup." Later, after the heat wave burned itself down to coals and the city exhaled, after Surindra had learned where the midday shadows ran like rivers and how to catch them with her body, after she had watched Cale teach a teen to splice a broken cable with the arrogant tenderness of an older sibling, there came the moment that would crack the mask she had worn and make the truth a hazard. A convoy of palace drones zipped through the underbridge with the silver flash of a knife in sunlight, projectors, running with the empathic marketing campaign her own team had approved last month. Soft faces, soft slogans about shared horizons. And though they were not looking for her specifically, one drone, out of curiosity or the intrinsic nastiness of algorithms trained on attention, swiveled its lens toward her. Surindra, whose blood knew the choreography of surveillance, tilted her face behind a moving shadow and thought she was safe. But Cale, who had grown eyes in the back of his neck in cities that ate the inattentive, put the back of his hand lightly against her shoulder in a gesture that could have been nothing and said, "Move." And by the time the drone's angle had cleared the shadow, he had folded his body inconveniently between her and the lens while pretending to adjust the strap on his toolbox, and the shot taken, if reviewed, would show a faded canvas back and the board set of a human jaw. And the princess who had one name in the palace and no name here felt something that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with safety. The specific gratitude felt when someone who owes you nothing spends their capital to protect your choice to be small. Chapter 3. A name like a loaded fuse. Surindra lasted 9 days before the palace found her, not because the hidden needed to be revealed, but because empires are built to discover deviation and to neutralize it as a malfunction. On the morning of the 10th day, when she had just learned how to sit on a coil of hose without her leg going to sleep, and had just taught an old woman the trick of folding a discarded courier docket into a hat against glare, a commotion rolled down the thoroughfare like a pressure wave. A squadron of white, lacquered security frames on silent gyros, flanked by 2 skimmer sedans with windows dark enough to hold back questions, and in their wake a handful of public relations drones pulsing their pastel sympathies. Cale felt the change through the soles of his boots the way an electrician hears a surge, and looked toward the sound. And Surindra's heart telescoped as she saw the crest on the lead sedan's side panel, the lotus cut, with a filament of lightning, the Trisavian sigil, and knew that the experiment was over and that the choice now was not between honesty and spectacle, but between 2 kinds of lies. The lie where she let them drag an anonymous beggar away for her own safety, while the bridge learned exactly how much compassion the palace had for such experiments, or the lie where she stood under her own name and tried to rewrite the script in real time under a rain of cameras. She did the thing fear told her not to do. She stood, and the standing made the security frames hesitate because poverty was supposed to duck and scurry, and the sedans hissed to a stop with expensive tires kissing grit. And when the door of the lead car lifted like the eyelid of a god, the chamberlain stepped out in robes that repelled dust by molecular arrogance, and said in a voice amplified to be heard by the bridge, as much as by the princess, "My lady, you are missed." The underbridge, which had its own news network of glances and whispers and improbable accuracies, inhaled as one organism as the phrase "my lady" drew lines between the frayed fabric and the jeweled towers, and Cale, whose face was built for straightforward machines rather than sideways politics, did not bow or step back. He only looked at Surindra, as if to ask, "Is this the moment you leave the problem unfinished like the sedans always do?" And Surindra, who had never in her life addressed the city from anywhere but a podium, found a voice that did not need microphones because it had the density of truth. "I came to listen," she said, with ash still at her collar and the foam pad under her feet like an oath. "And I am not finished." The Chamberlain, who had been trained to sheath knives and etiquette, smiled and turned to the nearest camera and crafted a story with the practiced speed of a surgeon tying off a bleeding artery. "Our beloved Surindra, ever devoted to the well-being of our people, has spent days incognito among them to better understand their needs, and now, for safety and for synthesis, she returns to the palace to prepare an unprecedented plan." And in that instant, 100 headlines wrote themselves in Drone's wings. But the underbridge audience did not speak drone. It spoke the grammar of who stands where. And what happened next bound Surindra to these people more tightly than any staging could. A woman with machine oil under her nails, the first to drop a roll by Surindra's knee when the experiment began, stepped into the open and said, not to the Chamberlain, not to the cameras, but to the girl she had fed, "You can't leave us to their words. If you got eyes, keep them here, not wrapped up in velvet meetings." And Kale, who abhorred slogans but believed in declarations when they were tools, added with rough courtesy, "If you go, go with an ask that is a wire and not a ribbon." Surindra understood that this was a negotiation with the palace as much as with herself, that if she got into the sedan now, she would be captured by the story already drafted in the Chamberlain's pupil, and if she refused entirely, the cameras would paint her as unstable, and the underbridge would pay for her defiance with a crackdown. She stepped between frames and foam pad and sedans, and did something the courtiers would call unbecoming and the bridge would call ordinary. She named the demand. Right there on the grid, as if it were a price at a stall. "I will return with 2 promises signed in the open," she said, and she felt the fuse run from her name into the palace circuits even as she spoke. "First, that the union crews and citizen fixers who hold this city together will have a seat and a vote in the maintenance board that decides what gets replaced and what gets patched. Second, that the underbridge, this one and its sisters, be declared civic commons, not dead zones, with budget for shade and taps and repair kits, so that being poor does not mean choosing between thirst and arrest." The Chamberlain smiled the smile of a man measuring liabilities and asked, with the silkiness of someone feigning reasonableness, "Who would represent the bridge?" And Surindra said the name that would prove that this was not theater. "Kale of the Union, and the woman who fed me when I had no name," which was not protocol, which was not how appointments were made, which was a stone thrown through a window in the boardroom. They tried to hustle her into the sedan, then as if ending the tableau would erase it, but Surindra turned, looked at Kale, and took the foam pad in her hand like a standard and held it high enough for the cameras to catch, and said, with a half-smile that might one day be carved into the base of a statue or forgotten entirely by the time the rain rusted the conduit again, "This is my first chair. I'll bring it to the meeting." And she let the door close on the breath the bridge had been holding. On the ride up through the stratified air, passing floors that smelled alternately of Limond marble and ozone, she prepared the war that would follow the gesture. The boardroom, the shareholders, the teeth behind the smiles, the statistics that could drown a demand if you didn't know how to swim in them. And for the first time in her life, the algorithms that would spin her words did not frighten her, because she had a counterweight now, something to calibrate them against that had the grain of reality on it, like a board that's been held by hands for years. The foam pad, the broth, the leak that could be patched if you just pressed mastic into it with a tenderness that refuses to be embarrassed. What followed were days built from arguments and midnights and the unexpected allies that reveal themselves when a person stops asking what is safe and asks only what is true. The maintenance board, 6 members in suits whose cuts spoke of the boardrooms of 5 continents, and one orbital listened with the stiff politeness reserve uses when confronted by the body of its work. And when Surindra announced that the agenda included a permanent seat for union crews and citizen fixers, 2 eyebrows rose like drawbridges and one sigh leaked like a valve gone. She brought numbers because palaces believe in numbers when they are set in a font that looks like commandments. How much downtime is saved when the people who touch the machines have a vote in which machines get replaced. How many credits protected when the decision chain shortens by 1 meeting and lengthens the life of a component by 1 year. But she brought stories, too, because she had learned under the bridge that numbers without a bone of story collapse under the first wind. She told the board about a human who pressed mastic into a leak not because it earned him a bonus, but because rain on a beggar's head was a failure of the city. And when they responded with talk of precedent and the fear of giving up a seat once given, she did the palace thing. She traded and offered to fold her own ceremonial chair into this new arrangement, to sit henceforth not in the windowed niche with the gilded microphone, but among the work chairs with the scuffed arms. It was theater, but it was also a ledger entry in the only accounting that ever matters: what you are willing to lose to make a thing real. When the board told her kindly, gravely, with the air of the responsible adult speaking to an idealistic child, that underbridge declarations could not be enshrined as commons because security risk analyses advised against it, Surendra brought not only the risk charts, but the faces, a parade of the people whose lives would change when a public tap was placed where a drone could not pry, and when she felt the old machinery of polite refusal begin to twine around her ankles like polished vines. She cut through it with the blade she had honed against the pillar. I will not present a vision of stewardship to the triarchs that abbreviates the human shape out of the graphs, she said. And they, who had thought the traditional speech was a mere rite, heard for the first time a cost to dissuading her: scandal, perhaps, or worse, clarity. The vote when it came was a knot of compromises, as all votes are, but the important strands held: a rotating seat for the Union and the citizen crews, beginning with Kale and the woman whose name, when she was found and asked to serve, turned out to be Nara, a pilot declaration of commons for 3 underbridges, including Surendra's, with budget lines that could be measured and audited by people whose backs knew those shadows. Chapter 4. The weight of gifts and the finish that isn't. The day of the vision came like a tram on fixed rails, whether Surendra had slept or not, whether the boardroom's grudges had cooled or not, whether the underbridge had made up new nicknames for her or not. The Triarchal Hall was all the things that crushed thought under admiration: ceilings that looked like the inside of a shell, a dais that elevated the speaker until she seemed to float, an audience whose clothes cost more than the first house Kale had ever seen, cameras that could smell hesitation, and somewhere far below all that, under stone and glass and pretense, a city waiting to see if this would be another staged coronation of benevolence or the beginning of a more difficult, less photogenic truth. Surendra carried nothing theatrical, no prop, but her small foam pad folded and tucked at her elbow like a file, and when she stepped to the dais the hall inhaled to hear what story wealth would tell about itself today. She did not use the old phrases. She did not say innovation or prosperity or legacy except to call them out as words that had clogged the language like fat in a pipe. She said instead the bridge's noun shade, tap, leak, chair, and put them in sentences that tightened like bolts. We will measure our stewardship not by how the spires catch the dawn, but by whether rain that finds a crack falls on hair or on foam. We will name, with signatures you can read, the seats we have added to the table, where maintenance is decided. And those seats will be held by hands that know the heat of mastic and the weight of a toolbox and the ache of a day that gives you nothing but the right to say you refuse to let the conduit win. We will declare the underbridge a commons here, here, and here. And if security must be part of that declaration, it will stand in service to dignity rather than dignity standing in service to the comfort of our fear. She told them the story of broth in present tense because that was how she had received it, not as an anecdote, but as a living voltage, and she said Kale's name and Nara's name, because names resist abstraction, and because the underbridge spoke in names, not titles. And when she finished, the hall did not do the usual thing it did with beautiful speeches glide over them like skaters on a pond, but sat, briefly and uncomfortably, in the weight of a gift that would require work in return. Back under the bridge, because a finish that matters requires a return. Kale watched the stream of faces flow under the new shade sails that flowered like sober flags from the pillars, and did the unheroic work of showing a teen how to open a repair kit and not cut himself. Nara scolded the tap installers for placing the spout too high for the children and won a small change that would never be noted in any report. The leak in the crossbay conduit, resentful of being upstaged by protocol, found a new microfracture and spat a single defiant bead that Kale crushed with a thumb and a swear and a grin. And all the while rumors ran like resilient weeds through the cracks of the city, that the princess had slept on foam, that she had refused to pose with a ribbon, that she had handed a chair to a man with dirt under his nails and asked him to sit at a table that had never seen such hands. Surindra came down in daylight, which caused less fear now that the hall had watched her say the names, and she did not arrive in a cortege, but on a single pod whose paint remembered weather. She sat where she had sat and watched, with the satisfaction that comes from seeing the plan survive its first contact with oxygen, as a small crisis resolved itself without invoking a drone. A courier cart's sensor, glitched by reflected heat off the news sail, tried to pivot where it should not, and a cluster of small, mutual competencies Kale's shove, a passerby's foot, Nara's hand on a child's shoulder closed the loop until nothing broke. It was a moment that would never be carved into a mural, and that therefore mattered, because the galaxy has always been held together by such moments, and always will be no matter how many speeches try to appropriate the glow. Later, in the long shade that came when the sun slipped behind the western towers, Surindra stood with Kale at the edge where the bridge's shadow let them see up into a sleeve of sky, and she tried awkwardly, because thank you is easier than asking for the shape of a debt, to give him something that was not a brass plaque or a staged photo. She offered him an appointment letter embossed with too much sigil and too much ceremony, and he accepted it not because he cared about paper, but because paper made doors open smoother. And when she tried to hand him a card that would access a vault in his name, he looked at it like a Ms. Wired panel and said, "The first time I bought my mother a fan that didn't whine, we felt like we'd climbed a mountain. Don't steal that mountain from some other fool by making it flat with money. Put the zeros on a line that ends in taps and shade. My kind of thanks is always a bolt turned or an hour saved." And she who had never had to learn the difference between a gift that refuels a life and a gift that cheapens a struggle put the card away and did as she was told. The city, being a city, found its dramas no matter how many leaks were patched. A faction on the board tried to claw back the Union seat by redefining maintenance, to exclude the very crews who kept the grid from panic. A reporter with excellent hair tried to bait Kale into saying something incendiary about nobles, and instead got a lecture on redundancy in oxygen farm circuits. A drone captured a moment of Surindra picking up a dropped wrapper and titled it Princess of Waste Management, and the underbridge laughed until it hurt. A small boy discovered that the shade sails the fabric of them, saying, "If you pulled them just so," and Nara swatted his hand, and then asked him, later, to pull them again so she could hear. In the palace, Rel returned the ash-gray bomb to an upper shelf with a private ceremony and let her scissors rest for a week. In the hallways where power drafts its memos, junior aides whispered that something in the air had changed, and that perhaps the next decade would be about sturdiness rather than sparkle. In the underbridge, Surindra learned to show up without announcing it, and to leave without needing to be seen leaving, which is a kind of maturity palaces do not teach. As for the question that had started it, the one about genuine kindness, where to find it and how to trust it, the answer did not arrive like a revelation, but like a habit. Surindra began to keep a thermos in her pod, and to hand it without speech where a hand on a knee could use heat. She learned to accept gifts from the anonymous with the seriousness of someone receiving a message written in a language she had been arrogant about not learning. She learned, too, that the only reliable test of kindness is whether it survives a lack of audience, whether it persists when cameras have wandered away and slogans have had their 15 minutes, and the only witnesses are a concrete pillar, a patch of sun, and the smell of rain in a conduit that will leak again come winter. She learned that Kale's gift was not the broth or the foam pad, or even the way he took a drone's eye like a shield. It was the calibration of his attention, his refusal to look past what was in front of him, and that this calibration could be taught if you stopped treating kindness like a virtue and started treating it like a craft, with apprenticeships and checklists and calluses. On an evening when the city's auroras were especially gaudy because a solar storm had punched the magnetosphere and made every tower sing, Surindra and Kale and Nara and a handful of people who, 2 months ago, would not have shared a glance stood at the edge where the bridge let the sky in and listened to the sails hum. A girl whose hands were always busy with paper turned an old docket into a crown that fit badly and placed it on Surindra's head with the ceremony of a sovereign ordaining a jester, and Surindra took it off and placed it, with a bow, on Nara's head instead, and Nara rolled her eyes and kept it on because the child laughed like a bell. Somewhere above them a decision was being drafted that would water down the Commons Declaration for the next quarter, and somewhere below them a pipe would crack before dawn, and somewhere far away a reporter would phrase a headline like a trap. And all of that would have to be met tomorrow with bolts and mastic and negotiation and, when necessary, stubbornness. For tonight, the shade held, and the tap ran, and the leek, resentful but domesticated, did not spit, and the princess who had once believed that meaning would arrive like coronation understood that the end of a story worth telling is not a flourish but a promise renewed, that the measure of the day would be counted at the level of the foam pad and the cup in the hand that steadied a cart without being asked. And if, years from now, some bright-eyed student of governance asks how Surindra the opulent found the narrow door that leads from spectacle to stewardship, the honest answer will be embarrassingly small for a history text. She sat down on cold concrete and kept her eyes low until a human who had every reason to hurry paused long enough to hand her broth and a square of foam and a sentence about rain. And she understood that to receive without deserving is to owe, not a performance of gratitude, but a life spent making it easier for the next person to be helped without humiliation. And if a skeptic says that all of this is merely anecdote and sentiment, that systems are not changed by stories, point them gently, implacably to the maintenance board minutes where a new chair scrapes each meeting against a floor that remembers storms, to the budget lines that buy mastic and taps instead of adverts and banners, to the child who can reach the spout because someone bothered to lower it, to the conduit that still leaks, yes, but leaks less and for shorter and with neighbors arriving faster. And then, if they need it spelled out plain, tell them that kindness is a scaffold, not a statue, and scaffolds are built by hands that do not mind being invisible as long as the work holds. That is the grace she learned, and the promise she did not break, and the finish that isn't, because cities are living things made of unfinished days, and the only good endings are the ones that send you back to the place where you first learned to see.